And once I've made a bunch of modifications to this object, if I like where it is, um, at some point I can choose to collapse the stack. What that means is going to take all of these modifiers and collapse them down into one thing called an editable mesh. Now, there's a lot of reasons that you would do this. It's kind of like flattening layers in Photoshop. Sometimes if you want to take an object and export it out and bring it into another scene, you don't want this whole stack, this whole history involved. You don't need it. It's not doing anything for you. You can go ahead and collapse that. There's nothing really wrong with leaving all of these modifiers intact. That's fine to do. 3D Studio it doesn't really cause any necessarily any overhead with it. So if you ever want to go back to an earlier version, it's kind of nice to have the stack intact like this. However, if you want to collapse it, again, if you want to export the object to something, if you just know you don't need this stuff, it's a good practice to get into. There can also be cases where you can have modifiers that may not be standard stock default 3D Studio modifiers. Like you can download modifier plugins that do even a whole new range of modification to your objects, and occasionally it won't be supported, that modifier that you've downloaded from Joe Schmo who wrote it and posted on the internet. And if you want to share that between people, then they may not have that plugin. Any of these modifiers that you have intact here depend on a plugin, and sometimes you can get errors if you're trying to share, or even if you move versions of 3D Studio. If you upgrade a version of 3D Studio, that modifier might not work in the new version, and then you would want to have a flat copy of it. So what you can do if you want to collapse the stack is you just right click in the modifier stack and you say collapse all. You can also collapse to. So again, it's kind of like Photoshop if you're familiar with it. You can collapse to a certain point, collapse up to this bend. Let's say if I collapse up to this noise, I can collapse to here. And now it's going to ask me a question, and it'll say this will remove a portion of the stack, and it's going to affect its parameters. Now I won't have access to the parameters underneath here anymore, and so any animation applied to those modifiers will be lost. And what you can do is you say yes or no. It's just going to remind you. You can choose to show this message or not. But then there's this other button called hold yes, and I'm actually going to click this button. I'm going to show you a thing in a second here called hold and fetch with 3D Studio. So I'm going to say hold and yes. And then it's it's flattened everything up to that point, but left me everything above that point. Now, what I've done is I may or may not like the result of that. Either it could give me errors, or maybe, oh, I really did want that to happen. I can always undo it, and that's the easiest way to do it. But 3D Studio also has, if I go to Edit and Redo, it also has this thing called hold and fetch. So if I go under the edit menu, you have your normal undo and redo, but then you also have this thing called hold and fetch, and what that does is if you hit hold, it holds that in memory. And then you can choose at any point. I can do a bunch of other things to it, say move this thing around and do things and delete stuff out of the stack or whatever. And then if I go back to fetch, it'll say about to fetch, and you can see what it does is it brings me back to that state of this exact state at which the scene was left in when I hit the hold operation. And so it can be a kind of another way to ensure that that before you do a potentially destructive operation, or before, say, I really like my scene at a certain point, let me try something, see if it works. Well, if it doesn't really work out how you planned, you can just hit go back to fetch and go back to a previous sort of state of your scene. So use hold fetch just in case you are about to try something and you may not like it. Now there's also, if you pick another object here, there's also, if you right click, you can collapse all. And what that does, again, ask me the dialog box, are you sure I want to continue? Yes. What that does is it collapses this thing into what's called an editable mesh, which just means that it's forgotten all of the parameters that it began with. And so this one began as a cylinder, and so it has all of these different. I can change the number of sides at any time I want to. I can change the radius, height at any time I want to. If I collapse the stack, collapse all, it's going to change it to just a thing called editable mesh, and now I can no longer make changes to the height, the number of sides, and all that stuff without doing it a slightly more complicated way. And so those things, those original objects, are called parametric objects, and then there's a distinction between those and editable mesh. Editable mesh is simply a collection, I'm going to zoom in on this thing here, simply a collection of faces and of polygons, faces, edges, vertices, that sort of thing. And now I have no way of easily, anyway, going back and changing the number of sides of that original parametric cylinder. And knowing when you want to do that or when you can and can get away with it, you'll get through experience. Again, there's really not a lot of overhead in keeping a stack unless it gets incredibly huge. At some point you may want to collapse it.